Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pep Talks Uncut. I'm your host, David Moore, and thank you for tuning in. It's another Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock, and we are back again for our show, which is unedited, uncut. It is unscripted, and what you see is what we recorded ahead of time. And once again, our special guest, he was here with us last week. Dylan Altemara is a candidate for the Pennsylvania 49th House District. And last week in our episode, we were talking about a variety of topics, among which were career training, wages in Pennsylvania, energy supply and energy sources. And what else did we cover? Let's see, we covered energy, career training, wages. Feels like there was another topic. I'm sure there must have been. Well, anyway, we're going to cover more today. Dylan, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me back.
Anything else you'd like to share with us as we start today's episode?
I would like to appreciate or offer my appreciation for having me back to do another taping with you. And hopefully the viewers and listeners felt that our last conversation added some value in their lives.
Well, good. Thank you. So I thought we would start today by mentioning somebody by the name of Redman. Redman, Method Man, and a few other folks were a part of a rap group, Wu-Tang Clan. And they're apparently all good friends with Ice-T and Snoop Dogg and a number of other recording artists. And I got to tell you, the pandemic has done some incredible things to their audience. In particular, they've had to move their audience from live concerts to virtual events. And so that's changed their whole outlook on that particular industry, the recording industry. But one of the things that Redman said makes that all possible is cannabis. And he is part and parcel of the National Cannabis Party, which is promoting the ideal of legalizing and decriminalizing cannabis, not only for medical purposes, but for recreational use all across the country in a way similar to what our neighbors to north in Canada have already done. And to me, it seems cannabis could be a multi-billion-dollar a year industry for the United States, one that would hire all kinds of people. And it's already working in states like California, Colorado, Alaska, and other Western states. So what should we be doing here in Pennsylvania to catch up?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to realize that the war on weed, or the war on drugs, more broadly speaking, has been a complete and utter failure. It has literally cost billions of dollars, countless thousands of lives, and for what? I would argue that if someone truly wants to get weed today, they can easily find it in any community throughout the Commonwealth, and this is despite years of the criminal justice system prosecuting people for deciding to smoke a joint. So clearly we have to end this broken practice. And I think one of the best things that we can do, especially now since the Democrats are in control in Washington, is ask President Biden to remove cannabis as a Schedule I narcotic. By doing so, that would restore gun rights to millions of people, including thousands of people here in Pennsylvania that currently cannot own a gun because they have a medical marijuana card. And then from there, clearly, we have to control its distribution, its manufacturing, sell it, and tax it. Right now, I think a lot of people don't understand one of the unintended consequences of keeping cannabis illegal has been it's really empowered the criminal element by pushing the business underground.
Okay, so one of the issues that has been raised by the National Cannabis Party is that as a result of putting cannabis in the control of the state in the form similar to state liquor control shops, is that what will happen is large businesses that we find, for example, in alcohol or tobacco, will eventually swoop in and take over the cannabis industry as well. And the Cannabis Party would love to see equity empowerment programs take place such that smaller farms and smaller smaller businesses are able to stay within the market and not lose their market share. Do you think that's a wise idea?
Absolutely. I think when you look at our hyper-capitalist system, brought about largely because we have antitrust laws with no teeth, the idea that companies in any particular sector are able to buy up more and more market share has really created an uncompetitive environment. So I think in rolling out a new industry, it would really be incumbent upon the Commonwealth to have certain safeguards in place to ensure that it is equal and fair competition amongst growers, amongst retailers, and anyone involved in the space.
So it seems to me that weed, maybe less so than other stronger narcotics, such as heroin or cocaine or something along those lines, weed doesn't bring with it the rough and tumble gun atmosphere that you would find with stronger drugs. But then again, I don't know for sure because I'm not in law enforcement and I'm not in a position to be able to cast judgment on the entire buyers and sellers of cannabis. But with that said, it seems to me that you mentioned guns and allowing cannabis users who have either a medical card or who have a low-level arrest record as a result of cannabis possession or cannabis distribution. You said gun rights should be restored to them. Where do you come down on gun rights overall then?
Well, I think clearly we live in a country that embraces the idea of having Second Amendment rights. And I truly do actually believe the Republican talking point that guns don't kill people, it's people that kill people with guns. Unfortunately, we don't do anything about those people. Hence, I believe implementing a universal background check system and closing the gun show loopholes is a great way to ensure the right people are buying guns and not individuals that are prone to violence. Secondarily, we hear so often about mental health, and it's true. We do have a national issue with mental health. Currently, 1 in 5 Americans has a mental health issue, of which 60% aren't currently receiving any help for. Part of that is because we don't have nationalized universal health care. Part of that is because I think there's still a negative stigma associated with having a mental health issue. I think also a lot of it's brought about just with how harsh our society and our economic system is to people. I think years of having that pressure continuously on you does after a while cause people to break. But furthermore, one of the things that we can do is ensure that if you do want, for instance, to carry a high capacity weapon, that you should be subject to annual or semi-annual mental health screens, just to make sure there's no red flags on your record, which put you or the general public at large in danger.
So in other words, you have no problem with people owning guns, whether for their own personal safety or hunting or just because it's their Second Amendment right. Some on the right, in particular in the world of guns, firmly believe in the Pennsylvania Constitution, which takes gun ownership to the next level, which is no laws can infringe on gun owners' rights. Do you buy into that theory?
Well, I don't necessarily know that it's wise to get into a legal debate about does a state constitution supersede that of the United States. I think if we want to consider ourselves part of a collaborative union, ultimately, I would allow and I would defer to the Constitution of the United States before saying that the Constitution of any one state ultimately dictates how gun laws should be written. And I think for those on the extreme, and let's be clear, there are those on the extreme that like to push and peddle the gun culture. I think it's honestly not because they treasure or value Second Amendment rights nearly as much as it's about, for instance, in the case of Republican politicians who take in thousands of dollars from the gun lobby, wanting a free and clear market so guns can be funneled to the gangs in Chicago and the drug cartels in Mexico and Central America.
To that end, one of the talking points that was used right after the Sandy Hook massacre is that it should be necessary to take higher magazine clips, the ones that can fire 30 rounds in a minute or so, or whatever the numbers are. But these higher capacity gun clips should be banned, along with a number of other technologies that guns are using. For example, being able to print a gun. In other words, using a 3D printer to design and print a firearm that can avoid detection through metal detectors.
Again, on those particular issues, I think as far as capacity, if there is a system in place to weed out those with troubling criminal histories or troubling criminal predictors, or those who are exhibiting mental health issues, I'm not so concerned about capping capacity, because as far as I'm concerned, if you address the problem on the front end, it won't subsequently then manifest on the back end. Now, with regards to 3D printing, I think that is certainly a chink in the armor that has to be addressed, just because it would, in my opinion, allow a lot of individuals, especially dangerous individuals, to circumvent any gun law or regulation in place.
Agreed. And to that end, it sounds like you come right in line with what Attorney General Josh Shapiro has been talking about frequently, which are ghost guns. He and Governor Wolf believe that it's necessary for the Commonwealth to tamp down on the number of ghost guns that are floating among the public. Do you see additional ways that the Commonwealth could tackle that problem?
I think it's an interesting situation to consider, just because I don't think you want intrusive monitoring to where we know particularly what a given individual is doing in their own home. But then at the same time, perhaps if we see where these ghost guns are showing up in a particular area, a particular region, maybe we should create a level of law enforcement that can be dispatched to that particular area when there is an abundance of those types of weapons in circulation.
And guns and other weapons frequently end up in violent crimes. And you note on your website that the current Pennsylvania Crimes Code was codified in 1972, listing 282 offenses. And you talk about how district attorneys across the state will use multiple layers of the law to overcharge defendants in criminal actions. What could be done to make the crime code cleaner and easier, and not necessarily weaker on defendants, but fairer?
Well, I think first and foremost, back in 1972, as you said, there were 282 crimes. By 2010, there were over 600 crimes. And today there's over 1,500 crimes. So I guess what we have to ultimately decide is what number is too many. And I think when you look at why the legislature has created so many crimes, it's in large part to create more criminals, because ultimately that's a great way to keep the system going. The more criminals, that's more money in the system to keep police on the beat, judges on the bench, jails and prisons open, not to mention all of the other people that live off the system. So I think we really have to get back to prioritizing violent crime and violent offenders. I think that's where the society's primary concern should be. And then with a lot of these low-lying offenses, instead of criminalizing them, I think we should offer non-prosecution alternatives, because ultimately, I don't really think people choose to bounce a $50 check or to steal Pampers from Walmart if they didn't have a better economic outlook.
Right, and that would all be a part and parcel of a jobs program, which would offer more opportunities to the citizens of the Commonwealth.
Correct.
And now to that end, you talk about eliminating cash bail, at least for non-violent defendants. Why?
Well, I think it's a complete and utter indictment of our Commonwealth that in a supposedly free country, we have people behind bars today, not because they've been found guilty by a judge or a jury of their peers, but simply because they can't afford to pay for their actual freedom. I understand having concerns over criminal defendants' level of danger to themselves or the community, but that's easily determined by the crime in which they've been charged with. If you have a violent offender who's been charged with a violent crime, they should be held until trial. But if you have somebody who's been charged with a non-violent crime, floating a couple hundred or a couple $1,000s to the coffers of Washington County or Fayette County or Allegheny County, where surprisingly cash bail is used more than in a lot of the red counties in Western Pennsylvania, really doesn't make sense to me. I think it's a punitive way to punish the poor.
I have to agree with you on that. And I think for that reason, I heard tale recently of a young lady who was apprehended in Dauphin County, and she was in a miserable spot. She was apparently out having dinner with her daughter, and her daughter appeared to have scratches on her, and somebody at a restaurant reported them, and the next thing she knew, she was behind bars in the Dauphin County Jail facing this massive bail, which to me seemed exorbitant. I have to agree. I don't think it's fair to put people in prison over debt that's accumulated as a result of bail.
Correct.
Now, what about at the opposite end of the criminal justice system? So once people have been rehabilitated, once they have gotten out of prison and they're seeking to get their rights restored, one of the first steps in that process is going through a governor's pardon. Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman has really sped up the process for low-level offenders, especially cannabis offenders, expediting their expungement process, their pardons. What would you suggest the Commonwealth do as we move forward? In other words, Lieutenant Governor Fetterman's eventually going to be out of office.
Right.
So should his replacement maintain these policies?
Well, actually, I think instead of making it an executive action, it should instead be a legislative action. I think if you're charged with a nonviolent offense, assuming that upon release, you can stay employed, you can follow the rules, and you can show that rehabilitation was successful, I believe the statute should be written where your record is automatically expunged. Now, as far as those who have been charged with violent crimes, I think that should remain a case-by-case basis with longer periods of assessment to determine as to whether or not the criminal justice system was successful in, again, rehabilitating the person, because we should not forget that the consequence of incarceration is to rehabilitate people, not to punish people.
Yet the criminal justice system is used, or had been used up until Governor Wolf, in the most violent of crimes. Murder comes to mind, but there were a few others in which Pennsylvania legally still has the death penalty. Now, Governor Wolf did implement a moratorium on the death penalty, but that's only during his term. When he leaves office, a future governor could very easily reinstate the death penalty here in Pennsylvania. Where do you come down on that? Should it stay or should it go?
Well, I think honestly it should go. It should be abolished, because at the end of the day, we cannot judge the conduct of a murderer or a violent criminal when we're willing to resort to the same action against them. Because we should not forget, when we put a convicted murderer to death, on their death certificate, the cause of death isn't justice. The cause of death is homicide. So do we really want that on our conscience, that we are, at the end of the day, no different than what that person's been convicted of doing?
I have to say that that really is an eye-opener to have homicide listed as the cause of death for people that have been executed by the state. Frankly, and I'm not sure if I've explained anything about my background, but I taught Holocaust history for a number of years. And to me, it seems having the death penalty on the books here in the United States really doesn't make our country that much more advanced than, say, Iraq or Iran or Nazi Germany.
No, it does not.
Okay, well, this show is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Equality Project, and we would not be the Pennsylvania Equality Project were it not for LGBT rights.
Mhm.
And President Biden has taken the LGBTQ community aside and said, I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to be a shoulder you can lean on. We are going to work to remedy a number of the injustices that have been perpetrated upon the community. And to that end, he, on day one of his term, lifted, through his Secretary of Defense, lifted the ban on transgender military personnel and allowed them to resume or continue their service without worrying about discharge.
Mhm.
But there are other LGBT issues here in the Commonwealth. What do you think some of the bigger issues happen to be?
Well, I think, this is unfortunately where sometimes we make it a conversation about language and pronouns instead of talking about the real issue, which is in Pennsylvania, it's still perfectly legal to evict somebody or fire somebody just because they happen to be a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And that really, I think, says something about where we stand as a society. And do we want to fix that? Or are we all right? Or are we all right with that? I personally believe that we have to make members of the community a protected class so that they are not subject to discrimination while on the job. And I think that we have to make sure that they are entitled to all the same rights that you or I or any other person might otherwise get to enjoy.
So you mentioned making them a protected class. That would include things like the Pennsylvania ethnic intimidation law. Now, for our viewers who are unaware, ethnic intimidation law in Pennsylvania is the equivalent of hate crimes law in other states. So should the LGBTQ community be included in the state's ethnic intimidation law?
Absolutely, because there's no question that in many communities throughout the Commonwealth, members of the community are specifically targeted because of their sexual orientation or their gender identification. And so that does, in my mind, qualify them for that protection.
And another scourge, I think, on Pennsylvania now, just because it hasn't impacted me here in Pennsylvania doesn't mean it hasn't impacted others. And that is conversion therapy. A number of municipalities in Pennsylvania, Allegheny County among them, have banned practitioners from performing conversion therapy on their patients. Where do you come down on conversion therapy at the state level?
Well, it's interesting because, as you know, depending on what state you're talking about, there's been a number of different ways this has been addressed. Some states have addressed it through executive action, other states through legislative action. Personally, I'm a proponent of whichever channel gets us to banning this junk science outright Commonwealth-wide. I think there are so many long-term damaging effects that this has on our children that whatever mechanism that can be utilized to ban it completely ought to be fully and thoroughly exercised. And I would go as far as to say that even with regards to religious organizations who continue to push this on kids, if that is their right to choose to do that, but then I think it's also our right to say, then we're going to challenge your tax exempt status.
That is a bold move, one that I don't think I've even heard from State Representative Brian Sims, who has been pushing a conversion therapy ban on minors for the longest time. Now, his ban would include people who are of adult age, but they are incapable of making decisions on their own behalf. So what I can't understand is why any parent or any grandparent or other guardian would see it fit to send a child or a young adult to a conversion therapy program that uses absolutely unproven techniques. In fact, and often the case is that these lead to depression, anxiety, and even suicidal iterations. And this has been demonstrated repeatedly. The American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, 15 other professional organizations have all come out against conversion therapy. So it's really good to hear you take a similar stand. Where do you come down in terms of using this defense in criminal trials? Well, you know, as soon as I knew that he was a she, well, I had to take action somehow. In other words, the gay panic or the trans panic defense in court. Does it hold the water?
No, it does not. Obviously, particularly when you're talking about individuals that are standing trial for violent crimes, the standard of evidence ultimately should rely upon the assessed degree of danger, not resort to, well, the gay defense or the transgender fear defense is sustainable justification. Ultimately, if the individual in question was put in danger by the other individual, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, and it can be determined based on the evidence that they are within their rights to defend themselves, that's one thing. However, just to go ahead and automatically point to the LGBTQ plus boogeyman and think that should be sufficient grounds is ridiculous and frankly quite discriminating and discriminatory in nature.
Former Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton put forward a number of legal briefs to the United States Supreme Court, and they were all directed towards abortion, which we'll come to in a moment. However, in his legal briefs that he's been generating and sending up to the court, he believes that decisions in Lawrence v. Texas and Obergefell v. Hodges, and might I add, Windsor v. United States, should all be overturned because there is no constitutional protection for homosexuality. Is he full of hot air, or should we fight? How do we fight back against that?
Well, I think it all comes back to, do Republicans respect law and order? Because if they respect law and order, then I don't think they would be challenging previously established precedents by the Supreme Court. I think the issue of marriage equality, frankly, just like abortion, has long since been settled, and any attempt to continue to reverse those gains, I think says something about, frankly, their victimhood mentality and the need by them to want to always just have law and order as long as it benefits their needs and views, the hell with everybody else.
One of the aspects that the Pennsylvania Equality Project prides itself on is we have done a number of outreach opportunities to other LGBT organizations across Pennsylvania, to pride entities, to LGBT centers, to youth shelters and so forth. And I gotta say, one of the things that troubles me is that there are gay kids, there are lesbian youth, there are others in the Commonwealth who are part of the LGBTQ plus community who are homeless as a result of their parents kicking them out of their houses. And they need safe spaces to go to, not only so that they can live their authentic and true selves, but so that they have some measure of protection. These centers desperately need more help. Can the Commonwealth afford to spare some money to shell out for grants or for other programs to allow them to do the work that is so desperately needed?
Well, I think certainly not only should the Commonwealth do it, but frankly, the Commonwealth has to do it. I think children are amongst our most vulnerable members of society. And frankly, the fact that they've been cast aside just because their mother or father has an issue with who they are says much more about the mother and father than it ever does that child. So I think the Commonwealth really has an obligation to ensure that in every county, the resources are being dispatched so that these children, at the end of the day, have a place to lay their head at night, have a place to receive a meal, and have a place to receive the type of love, attention, and frankly, care that clearly they weren't receiving at home. Furthermore, I would also add that in those cases, I would almost criminalize the practice of somebody giving up their child just because they have an issue with their gender identity or sexuality. To me, I don't think perhaps there's a more apparent form of child abuse.
Now, to that end, I have to give full disclosure. The Pennsylvania Equality Project has done an analysis of the entire Commonwealth and noted that Northwest Pennsylvania, in particular Erie, Crawford, Warren, Venango, and Franklin counties, lack an LGBTQ plus safe space shelter or community resource center. Venango County, I know, has one. Erie County has one, but neither of them are open 24/7. Neither of them are functioning on a round-the-clock basis to be there as a resource to those in need when they need it. And the Pennsylvania Equality Project wants to step up and fill that role by opening such a center here in Meadville. So I felt it necessary that come up because that directly led into the questioning we just went through. Oh, I see what you said. A $10,000 civil penalty for people who discriminate against LGBT persons concerning housing. Would you really implement such a thing?
I would, yes.
And you also talked about other rental inequities. Would you care to shed some light on those?
Certainly. So I think when you look at the Landlord Tenant Act of 1951, currently the law of the land as it relates to landlord-tenant relationships in Pennsylvania, I think it's really a law that is dramatically skewed to favor the landlord. And this through a number of different mechanisms. There are not standardized protections in place for the amount of notice that a landlord needs to provide a tenant if, say, they're behind on the rent. Landlords, especially larger landlords, can include language to have those provisions waived. And I think that really brings me to a place, especially myself as a previous struggling tenant, that we need to have a universal standardized rental contract, Commonwealth-wide, that ensures the rights of the tenant and landlord are fully in practice, regardless of whether it's a small tenant, or excuse me, small landlord, large landlord, rural region, city region. I think having standardized language goes a long way towards ensuring that protection. But then in addition to, I think there should be price controls in place. I do not believe that landlords should be able to raise rent more than 6% annually. And I think when you look at the Oregon model, particularly with respect to eviction, we can really benefit, I think, dramatically by extending the timelines and the requirements that landlords must first satisfy before they try to put somebody out on the street, because losing your home is one of the perhaps most damaging things that somebody can experience. And that's especially true if they have young kids.
Well, I couldn't agree with that more. And now that you brought up young kids, I said we would talk about abortion, and well, here we are. What is your position on abortion?
So I think when you look at our Constitution, it's clear that we are not to have an established national religion. So I think the effort by any politician at any level of the government to invoke religious beliefs concerning the application of who should be entitled to an abortion or who should not be entitled to an abortion is completely antithetical to our system of government. Furthermore, I would add that if you actually have ever read the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, Numbers 5 through 9, 11, and 39, it's quite illuminating as far as what the book says in terms of actually being, in my opinion, pro-abortion. And ultimately, as long as the fetus or zygote is relying upon the mother for life, it's her decision. Now, once you're beyond 24 weeks, I think there should be only exceptions for rape or incest, and that's in line certainly with current Pennsylvania law.
Well, I would also argue that if the life of the mother's in jeopardy, or if the child is known to be stillborn at birth, then a mother should be able to have an abortion without fear of legal repercussions. So, for example, in states like Ohio, their abortion law, I think, is just absurd. They expect mothers who have just gone through a miscarriage not only to get a death certificate for the zygote or child or fetus or whatever term you care to use, and they also have to go through funerals.
Mhm.
That to me seems like it's just padding the pockets of the funeral industry.
Well, and I think it's perhaps the most intrusive example of big government, which supposedly they're against.
Well, I agree with you there. Okay. And finally, for today's show, let's take a moment to talk about workers' rights.
Mhm.
Where do you stand in terms of unionization of Pennsylvania workers? Should we be a right to work state, or is that just a stupid euphemism for a company can fire you with no cause?
Well, I think it's a stupid euphemism that unfortunately has been co-opted by a number of Republicans in a number of states just to further keep people poor and depressed. If anything, when I look at the value that unions have historically added, there's no question that members of a union have enjoyed higher pay, better benefits, and more protections on the job. Unfortunately, with respect to unionization, not just nationally, but in Pennsylvania, participation is at an all-time low. So one of the ways that we can help bolster workplace protections is by eliminating the current employment law, which makes us an at-will state, and switching to a system similar to what you see in Montana, where after the initial probationary period, all employees, regardless of classification or whether they're part-time or full-time, are considered permanent. And in order to be terminated by their employer, there must be justifiable cause, or else the employee can pursue litigation against the employer. And I think specifically, if we're interested in adding protected employment classes, that makes sure that those class protections aren't being circumvented. Because again, when an employer can fire you at any time for any reason, including for no reason at all without notice, how solid are you truly in your job?
Well, okay, you mentioned the Montana model, and I'm not quite familiar with it, but I would argue, would the same law then protect municipal employees who could easily be mismanaging Commonwealth funds or county funds, or maybe they're just total screw ups in their jobs? If
Well,
they've survived the probationary period, I mean, isn't there a process for getting them removed?
oh, certainly. Being a just cause state doesn't mean that individuals have a job for life and can't be fired. It just means the standard of evidence has to exist in order to terminate somebody. Under a just cause system, you just can't fire somebody arbitrarily because you don't like them anymore, or because you want to fire them to hire your relative, which is currently perfectly legal as an at-will state. Just cause means exactly that. You can do something just because there is cause to do it.
Well, Dylan, sadly, all good things must come to an end, and we've run out of time for our second episode. It has been a pleasure having you on the show. I got to tell you, we have covered a lot of ground, and I think we touched on just about all of the key components of the issues that you've addressed on your website. I hope you believe you had an opportunity to air your thoughts on these positions, and we hope you'll be successful in your upcoming campaign. Now, mind you, our organization cannot endorse political candidates. We are a 501c3. And at some point, we will be extending an invitation for any Democrat or Republican or other party challengers who want to come forward and appear on our show. And they're going to get hit with the same questions we've gone through today. And we'll let the voters decide.
Well, thank you so much again for extending this opportunity to me. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And I hope, again, like I said previously, that the audience feels somewhat illuminated by today's discussion.
We appreciate that very much. So thank you again. And ladies and gentlemen, we will be back next week, October 10th, for yet another episode of Pep Talks Uncut. We'll have a special guest at that time, as we always do, and we look forward to seeing you then. Take care, everybody, and have a great Sunday. Bye-bye.